Thank you for joining us this morning for our EPC policy dialogue. And now, what strategic compass for Europe? A very warm welcome to all that have joined this conversation. For those who don't know me, I'm Georg Riekeles, Associate Director at the EPC, and I'll be moderating today's debate. With us today, we have an excellent panel of insiders and expert commentators. Tania Lațici is Policy Officer in the Security and Defense Policy Division at the External Action Service. She's had a hand on the pen of the Strategic Compass for the past 20 months. She's also a fellow of SEPA and a NATO Young Leader. We have Sven Biscop with us, who is professor at the University of Ghent and director of the Europe in the World program at the Egmont Institute. He's one of the most prolific and respected writers on European security. His latest book was titled The Grand Strategy in 10 Words, A Guide to Great Power Politics in the 21st Century. We have Elena Lazarus, who is head of the External Policies Unit of the European Parliamentary Research Service. She has also been extensively involved in debates and expert groups around the Strategic Compass. Previously, she headed up foreign policy institutes in Greece and Brazil, and her research focuses also very much on EU security and defense, global governance, and transatlantic relations. And finally, our very own Shea, Senior Advisor on Security and Defense Policy here at the European Policy Center. As many of you know, Jamie was, until 2018, Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO, and he was also NATO's spokesperson during the 1999 Kosovo War. So a warm welcome also to all four of you. I believe nobody imagined we would debate the EU strategic compass in such dramatic, tragic circumstances. Every day, night, millions across Europe follow in horror and solidarity the plight and courage of the Ukrainians, of the Ukrainian people in facing Russia's unprovoked war of aggression. And the 24th of February certainly was a watershed moment also, when the rude geopolitical awakening for Europe as a whole. And I think we all feel it calls into question many fundamental assumptions, and answers are being made up as we go along. There's a silver lining so far, which seems to be the unity of action and positions between member states inside the EU, with NATO, with the US. At the same time, as answers are being made up as we go along, as I said, we have at the EU level been engaged over the past 20 months in a strategic rethink, and that is the strategic compass process that is about to conclude. It will be adopted at the Foreign Affairs Council in 10 days on the 21st of March, and then endorsed by the leaders at the European Council. I think it's been a new process for the EU, in the sense that it's been preceded, or as part of it, the EU has conducted for the first time a comprehensive threat analysis. So that is now a classified intelligence report, but it is, in terms of outcome, also a common strategy document going forward that is part strategy and part action plan. And I think what strikes me today, when we see the very fast changes in European and national security and defense outlooks in individual countries, in NATO, in the EU, important changes day after day, I would like then to start off by maybe giving the floor to Tania to kick off this discussion with the insider perspective and the latest information. What is happening now to the compass on process and substance? Has this strategy reflection been overtaken by events? Can it catch up with them? We will have impulse statements from all four panelists, and then we'll aim for a free-flowing discussion with questions from the audience. So just to say, the audience, you can, once our panelists have made their impulse statements, put up your hands and ask questions, but you can also post questions in the chat that I can pick up throughout the discussions. But Tania, the word first to you. How do you see the strategic moment we are in now, and what does that mean for the strategic compass in its final stages?
Thank you very much, Georg, and to the EPC, of course, for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here, and I think also the timing of this event is spot on. You asked about process. You know, this week, both quite literally and strategically, the Compass has been circling the Rond-Point Schuman with a flurry of COREPER meetings, meetings of PSC ambassadors, asking and answering some of the same questions that you are posing as well, and some of the questions that the event poses. How is Russia's invasion of Ukraine going to impact the Compass? Can we adapt the Compass? Should we postpone the Compass? Will this forever transform the EU? So I'll do my best to try to elucidate at least three of these questions, and then perhaps more in the Q&A. So to give you a bit of a flavor of what's the mood in the corridor of powers around Rond-Point Schuman. So let's start with the first question. Will Russia's invasion and war in Ukraine impact the Compass? Well, let me say that it doesn't take much foresight to say that, of course, the document is and will continue to be adapted to reflect the implications of the war and the implications of Russia's actions for the EU, for Europe at large, and for the world. It's only natural. We don't aim to have an abstract policy document that is merely ticked away on our policy agenda, done, we can congratulate ourselves now. That's certainly not the point. And on the 24th of February, you know, very ironically, the Day of Love in Romania, we were all naturally trying to process the enormity of the events that were unfolding before us, because Russian tanks were not only advancing in Ukraine, but they were outright trampling on the European security order or disorder, but the one that we knew as we knew it. And I can confess sincerely that it was very difficult to put aside the reports, the readouts, the calls, and sit down and try to think and reflect about how to ensure that the Compass can be clear-eyed, can remain determined and actionable, to have a real, but I mean real guidance and ambition in the document. That is the intention. So I can tell you that one, the Compass will not be shy in diagnosing our strategic environment. The Compass will call it as it is. And second, the Compass will also not be shy in making clear that we as Europeans have a responsibility to respond to this through clear actions and clear solidarity. And this will be very concrete and actionable, as you also hinted. It's part an action plan and part strategy. I think this is a fair description. I must also join, I think, the list of EU officials who mentioned the huge milestone that we achieved with our actions under the European Peace Facility, which was achieved under a very intense weekend, I can confess to that as well, in about 24 hours. So I'm referring to this because the tone and the ambition and the vision for what EU defense can achieve has changed as a result of that. And I don't want to sound too self-congratulatory here, because I think the circumstances in which this occurred are quite horrific. So I'm quite careful about that. And one last thing on this point, funnily enough, about 2 evenings ago, 3 of us on this panel were having dinner together. And of course, on EU foreign policy, what else does one discuss over dinner? But something that Elena said then has stuck with me. She said that, yes, EU foreign policy is mostly determined by the lowest common denominator among the EU 27, but that this lowest common denominator can actually be very high once we have a degree of unity and mutual understanding. And this was certainly the case when it comes to punishing Russia and when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And these have direct links and consequences for the Compass. That was the first question. The second question, should we postpone the Compass? It'll be a quick one. The EAS position is no. My own personal position, if anyone cares about that, is also no. And this is simply because our aims and ambitions in becoming a stronger security and defense actor as the EU, they remain. Russia, I think, has only reinforced our resolve. And I think it's precisely because this is such a consequential moment that it is even more urgent for the EU to have a clear guiding post in the months and years to come. And it is also a test of credibility as well to get this done. Now, that being said, of course, big caveat, important caveat, the decision remains in the hands of member states. And now we also see that the Compass has actually become what we call Chefsache, right? EU heads of state and government are going to discuss in the summit in Versailles a bit later today, everything that we are discussing today. What are the consequences for our common defense? How is this going to reflect in the Compass as well, among others? Third question, will this or all of these events transform the EU? I think this was one of the questions that was in the first invitation email that I received. And it's a good one because I think it already has transformed the EU. I think so much has happened in these past days that it's difficult to truly comprehend the tectonic shifts that have taken place and their long-term consequences for how the EU looks and how the EU can do foreign and security and defense policy. I already mentioned the historical decision on the EPF. Germany made the headlines, well, it already made the headlines before, but for different reasons. Now it made the headlines for its U-turn on defense policy. Denmark wants to get rid of its opt-out, or is asking its people if they want to get rid of the opt-out. Finland and Sweden are reconsidering their NATO membership. Ireland is hosting and holding a national debate on their neutrality. One member state after another are pledging more defense spending, more investments in resilience and other relevant things in this context, and taking unprecedented measures to help Ukrainians, ones that we couldn't have thought of before, even in my own country. And as a last point here, when EU unity and the strength of EU measures are being discussed and praised even in Stephen Colbert's late night show in the US, or when New York Times podcasts are explaining to listeners the powers of the European Commission and how sanctions are agreed and what the European Peace Facility does, I mean, then you realize that actually something quite big is happening, quite the tectonic shift, as I said. So to sum up, to not be too long, just to be a bit provocative, summing up, yes, the Russian invasion has had an impact on the compass. No, we will do our best to not postpone the compass, but of course, member states own it, so it's in the hands of member states. And third, yes, I believe this has already had a transformative effect on the European Union, but also, sadly, again, to not be too self-congratulatory, also on the European security order as we knew it. So that's all from me for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Tania. Sven, we hear what Tania is saying. She's saying the tone, the vision, the ambition has already changed for what the EU can achieve. She says the lowest common denominator is going to be quite high, and she says there's an urgency now to adopt this compass now, to get on with it, and to start delivering some of the pledges, some of the actions that member states have been discussing. If I ask you to take your sort of more of an outside grand strategist's view on this, what would you say that the war on Ukraine should mean to Europe's security strategy, and what should we maybe be thinking about differently now compared to what we were thinking before the 24th of February? And is the compass, how relevant is the compass, would you say?
Thank you, Georg, and thank you for the invitation. The combination of outside and grand is probably a diplomatic way of saying vague and not remotely aware of what's actually going on. But I'll take it as a compliment nonetheless. Somehow I'm thinking of the moment in time when I had almost finished transforming my PhD dissertation into a book on the Europe and the Middle East. And it was nearly well done. Then the Americans decided to invade Iraq. And I thought, and obviously one cannot rewrite the whole thing, but it would have a great impact, but also a rather unpredictable impact. And there you are. And so somehow I feel the challenge for the drafters of the compass. That of course this has actually been going on for a year now, if not longer. But the difficulty I think is in the public perception is that most people are of course unaware. So they will see war in Ukraine, and a month later, publication of the strategic compass, they say, "Aha, here is the EU's answer." Whereas obviously the dynamics are much more than only the war in Ukraine, if I dare say so. And I think whatever we do, it's gonna be a hard sell. I would argue that the compass remains extremely relevant and that we need it for three reasons. I quickly want to sum up. One, of course, we're all now looking east, but let's not forget about the south. NATO is certainly focusing on the east, and that's what it's configured to do. But there are still security problems in the south. Who's going to take care of those? If we don't do it ourselves as Europeans, preferably through the EU. Let's not forget also that we don't have to just counter Russia in the east. We have to counter it in the south. if you think about it, it's quite spectacular that with minimal means, Russia has been able to get us kicked out of Mali, for example. So maybe this is an opportunity also to end this artificial debate that we always have within the Union about East versus South. I think seen from Russia, this is just one big theater. And they will operate anywhere in this theater where they see a chance to thwart our plans. So let us be bold and say we will take the lead as EU in stabilizing the southern neighborhood, so that NATO and certainly the US can focus more comfortably on the east. To the hybrid threats, I think we can probably only expect an intensification of hybrid actions against us by Russia, but also by others. I think many of the instruments that we have to deter hybrid threats are at EU level, not at member state level anymore. And I think that the hybrid chapter of the compass is really important. I understand there have been difficult debates about the issue of deterrence of hybrid threats. I mean, I'm convinced this is really where we need to go to develop, how to say, a simple doctrine. I mean, the essence of it should be simple, that we as EU together will regard any hybrid action against any member state as a hybrid action against all and retaliate as EU. So we need a doctrine of deterrence of hybrid threats. I think only the EU can do that for us. And thirdly, capabilities. I mean, there is now a strong dynamic. I think it's really a very good precedent that we use the European Peace Facility, which, let's be honest, we imagined that we would deliver some limited number of small arms and light weapons to some friendly African country. We're delivering 500 million worth to a European country in the midst of a shooting war. Very good, but of course this doesn't do anything for our own defense. So let's not mix the two in the debate. For our own defense, it's good that there is a momentum to do more, but I think now we must take care that we translate this momentum into the right structural measures that will permanently enhance our defense capabilities. So I remain convinced that the best way to make the most out of newly available means is to pool our defense efforts by making maximum use of EU instruments, PESCO, EDF, and so on, to help member states create the capabilities that they need for NATO, for the EU, and for any other commitments that they want to undertake. I would be bold now, and this will be, I will end on that. Of course, you know, think tankers being think tankers, i.e. irritating, nasty characters, most of us, we would always say it's not good enough, it's not concrete enough, more could be done. And so what I'm about to say, I said it in the full knowledge, it's very easy for me to say it, and that in reality, Tania and her colleagues have to get this past 27 member states. But I do think that in order to make the compass credible, ideally it would be announced simultaneously with the immediate capability initiatives. If we cannot introduce it in the compass because not everybody agrees, let those member states who want to do something use the announcement of the compass and say, on this very day, in implementation of the compass already, we hereby announce that we're going to launch A, B, and C. And let's be bold, you know, where is the European drone command? Where is the European cyber command? Where is the European missile command? All the stuff that we've known for years that we need, but so far we haven't made an effort. Let's try and use this momentum and the adoption of the compass to immediately announce some initiatives to implement it. Voila, I rest my case there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. I think it's a very good case already. You said it's a relevant compass, but a hard sell. And you point to 3 areas where the compass will be relevant in what it's working on: the southern neighborhood, the capacity to act then in crisis management, hybrid threats, and boosting capabilities. But you also point to things that need to come together with the compass or immediately afterwards. And I think that's already an interesting perspective to the debate. Elena, what do you think has changed in what we need from the compass since the 24th of February? Or maybe I can ask you, the sort of the reciprocal question, are there things in the compass that you think should not change? Is there a risk now that focus turns too much on immediate events and Russia, on supporting Ukraine with weapons through the European Peace Facility? What about, again, the broader perspective? What do you think is most important in this compass now as we move into the final days of its drafting?
Thank you, Georg. Thank you to the EPC for inviting me. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to be a bit creative because Sven and Tania have covered a lot of what I wanted to say, which can be explained in many ways, including how much I've read Sven's books when I was doing my own PhD. But let me try to respond to your question. I mean, my first point was going to be that self-congratulation on the peace facility is abounding, but I think what is important to congratulate, I call ourselves or Europeans in the EU for is beyond that, perhaps, and bigger than that. And I think it would be the foresight that's been had. I think going back to the to the global strategy, looking at the process that has led to the nth draft of the compass now. They say 3, but I know from Tania it's not just 3. I think in the background there's more drafts. I think looking back to 2016 and the global strategy, we've been talking about resilience, we've been talking about principled pragmatism, we've been talking about hybrid threats. We've been talking about Russia in a way that has been evolving, and a specific doctrine vis-a-vis how to approach Russia has not been there, but it's been evolving. And so I think the first thing I'll say, because you asked me what shouldn't change, I think the process, albeit slow due to the number of member states, etc., the process has had a logic, which I think at this moment is being proven correct. Correct given the treaty restrictions, given the nature of the EU. If you look back to 2016 and arguably even more further back than that, 2013, when the European Council starts talking about capabilities, it's the right path. And I think we can say, you know, there's been a robust process evolving, or rather a process with a robust evolution for the past almost 10 years now, that we can say, had it not been there, a counterfactual, we would be at this moment today staring around trying to figure out what to do. And I think many around this table know that I have been accused of being too critical of the EU in the past week, but I think on defense, but I think on this, I think I'm not. I think I'm saying we have the mechanisms now because this process has been ongoing. I think the biggest visibility of that, and perhaps because of being in Parliament, I think of the financial aspects a lot, is in the fact that we have one fund on capability development, and we have an off-budget instrument, as has been mentioned, which, breaking a taboo now, can provide lethal equipment to states that are in crisis or in war. And I think that is, if anything, a big element that not only, as you asked, should stay, but has been thought about not only correctly, but also smartly in terms of what can be done within what the treaty provides. So that's the sort of first overarching philosophical element of it. What's happening since the 24th of February, and I imagine of all of us here, Tania is the most privy to that in terms of what is changing word by word in the compass. I would say some years from now, we will be looking at as a development of a national security strategy and doctrine that has happened in other states before, and that is natural, but we're facing it in a crisis moment. But I think it is natural. It is not something that should surprise us. However, it does have some implications for things that should stay, but should be revisited. And the first among those for me would be that perhaps a plan to revision the threat assessment, which I understand may be being considered, would be one that would make sense. First, immediately to face the current crisis, but then in general to reconsider what is really the horizon when 27 member states I'm assuming now Denmark as well, I think, are thinking together about what they perceive as threats to their security environment. And we have to think, depending on how the geopolitical environment is moving, the temporality, the timing of that will be important, also taking into account the decision-making structures that the EU has and how long they take. So threat assessment is one thing I think we should think about. Now I want to move to action briefly, again on elements that I think have been proven correctly thought about and elements that we could think about beyond that. On crisis management, I completely agree with Sven that the South is just as relevant today as ever before, if not more, because the link between big geopolitical actors and other theaters of action has been more than ever proven and shown. I think not only Ukraine, but also Afghanistan should cause reconsideration of how we think about the limits of action of our crisis management tools, including our missions and operations, and it is underway. But I think the resilience of the missions and their specific tasks that they are formulated to carry out are being seriously and pragmatically being looked at the moment. And I think that will perhaps there'll be stronger wording in the compass on that. On capabilities, again, we've just had the Commission contribution to the strategic compass, which is a lot about reinforcing the European defense industry. And I think that as well is something that, well, also with the provision, well, with the emergence of this hybrid warfare, I think technology capabilities is more than ever becoming a part and parcel of what we'll be needing. But I do note here that somehow since the 24th of February, I don't seem to have heard the word PESCO except for the military mobility dimension, which is also financed separately and also a NATO EU project. So maybe we have to look at the PESCO projects in this context of this crisis and think more about them. On resilience, hybrid warfare, yes, as Sven has just said. I think it's important to consider that actors like Russia will use all domains in the warfare they carry out, and therefore that resilience should be thought of in terms of every domain that is identified, but also resilience in the more classic sense as it was in the global strategy, in the sense of building resilience in the neighborhood of potential theaters of warfare. So Belarus, Moldova, Belarus obviously a problem. It's not somewhere where we could have done more perhaps in terms of Belarus resilience, so societal resilience. And of course, Moldova and Georgia are now places that we should be looking at. And finally, partnerships. And I'm sure Jamie will talk more about this, but the EU-NATO partnership, the utilization of the instruments that have been thought about, the high-level dialogue with the US, the Trade and Technology Council, when we think about export control as sanctions, UN Security Council with Russia on it, how do we deal with our partners in the UN when we will be facing that in the future? So what does it mean for multilateralism? So I think partnerships in an environment where the main rival is one of the greatest military powers of the world, it will be even more important to think about in the context of the compass. So I close here, but as you've noticed, everything I've said is already in the compass. So actually my response to your question is there's a lot there to keep working on. Thank you.
Excellent, Elena. A lot there to keep working on. You also said that there's a value in the compass in what has already happened up until now, because it has in the whole process brought Europeans together in common threat assessment, and that needs to continue. And thank you also for providing the tradition to Jamie, ending on partnership. I think, Jamie, you're the last one out, meaning the freedom to touch on and respond on all this, but like Elena was suggesting, how do you see this in terms of the discussion between the respective roles of EU and NATO, division of labor, division of roles? Is this still about the EU being a crisis management, whereas NATO is there to guarantee collective defense, or are all these lines now moving at the same time? How do you see the link between the strategic compass and the strategic concept, NATO strategic concept that will be adopted later this spring or ahead of the summer at the Madrid summit? Jamie, give us your thoughts.
Okay, well, Georg, thank you very much. When you proposed me to be the last speaker, I was delighted because being with three of my best friends and most, from my perspective, most admired commentators, I thought, great, being last, I'm going to be able to steal their ideas, put them in my own words, and the audience will take away the conclusion that they all came from me, quite erroneously. But no, Georg, thanks for inviting me. Even if I'm associated with the EPC, I'm still delighted to be invited to appear at EPC events. Look, my take is, look, I welcome the compass because it moves the EU in a much more realistic direction in terms of a realistic assessment of the security environment. It posits the notion that the EU has interests, which are also values, but have to be defined in interest. The threat assessment is a major breakthrough, particularly when you think of the difficulties that all of us had in NATO and in the EU in the past to accurately categorize and qualify threats. It links also the defense dimension, which has already come up in the discussion, importantly, with the larger dimension of the EU as a security player in the world. And yes, it has to be a living document, obviously, because we're likely to be in a security environment that's going to be transforming with enormous instability for some time to come. Now, the first thing that I would highlight, of course, is that any sort of strategic compass, any EU sort of strategic autonomy, first of all, has to reduce dependencies. Now, this is difficult for an organization like the EU because, of course, the EU has always been a great promoter of globalization against a lot of protectionism in the world. And globalization is based on the acceptance of dependencies, as in everybody's interest. So, you know, how the EU continues to preach globalization, but while at the same time reducing dependencies, it is a difficult balancing act. But one thing I think that's really come out of the Ukraine crisis, where the EU has played a very good role so far, and with a great degree of unity, you know, is the sanctions on Russia, the notion of, you know, getting Russian finance out of European markets, the Commission proposals, just a couple of days ago, to reduce dependency on Russian oil and gas, even if, of course, this will have to be gradual, but moving in that direction, which even countries like Germany, very dependent upon Russian oil and gas at the moment, the Netherlands too, at least, you know, by and large, agreed to, because of course the crisis has shown that the more dependencies you have on vis-a-vis geopolitical actors, the more leverage they're going to have over you in a crisis. But this also ties up with what was said by Elena, you know, things like the Trade and Technology Council, harmonizing technology standards with the United States to be able to push back against alternative technologies proposed by others, the anti-coercion instruments, for example, which the European Parliament, European Commission have been developing, the way in which the EU has bravely stood up for Lithuania after it opened the Taiwan representation office and taken the case on behalf of the EU to the WTO. So in other words, yes, so this is not, you know, the immediate defense military capability aspects of the strategic compass, but it's embedding it in a wider set of EU instruments, which can gradually make the EU a more autonomous actor, precisely by gradually shifting away from those dependencies. And I think, you know, given that this was always such a difficult issue in the past, as previous, you know, rounds of sanctions on Russia had shown, easier to target oligarchs rather than whole, you know, segments of the Russian industry, and the way in which, by the way, EU business, let's not forget that, you know, not necessarily forced by governments to go along with sanctions, but the whole way in which the EU private sector has got into the game. You know, the private sector has gone to war against Russia over Ukraine, and this sort of, you know, not necessarily coordinated, but spontaneous partnership between EU government action and private sector action certainly makes the effect of those sanctions on the Putin regime much quicker, much more painful, and less easy to adjust to. But of course, there are other issues like Russian shipping, you know, because it's okay embargoing Russian oil, but then if you have to import the oil that you're still importing from the Gulf in Russian ships in your ports, that's another thing. Dependency on Russian rare earths. We're not really going to be able to make the green transition if we still depend on Russian nickel. So, you know, lots still more to do. But I would really give the EU 8 out of 10, at least for the part of strategic autonomy, which is reducing dependency. The next thing is resilience. And again, this has been referred to. The issue we're going to have is that our definition of being at war with Russia is not the same definition that Mr. Putin has of being at war with us. And the danger is that whereas what we do has red lines, like NATO not putting troops, for example, in Ukraine, or not transporting MiG-29s to Ukraine at the moment, or not establishing no-fly zones, whereas we may think we have a sort of a pretty good red line between what is defensive, what is assistance, and what is involvement. It's not clear that as time goes by and more EU and Western weapons flow into Ukraine, that Putin is going to see it that way. And therefore, I do think, and we're seeing this already, a big attack on Sweden the other day, cyber attacks on the Baltic states, that Russia will resort to those hybrid instruments that Sven rightly underlined. And therefore, the whole work of the EU in building that kind of resilience on critical infrastructure, stress testing, vulnerability mapping, the way in which the EU has already sent cyber teams to help Ukraine, the way in which PESCO is also looking at some of these issues in terms of solidarity and assistance, is, I think, another thing that's going to be very important. Sven also mentioned the neighborhood, and I agree. I mean, the whole crisis has once again demonstrated that the EU strategic autonomy, EU security, does depend on having a ring of friendly countries around the periphery of Europe. I think one urgent aspect of EU policy, of course, is to look at Georgia and Moldova. The war aims map that President Lukashenko of Belarus outlined the other day ended with a Russian invasion of Moldova. I don't know to what degree that's Hollywood fiction or really part of Russia's war plans, but clearly Moldova is going to be in a more fragile position as Russia extends its reach along the Black Sea coast and deprives Ukraine of a coastline, which also, of course, will undermine its economic functionality in the long run. So we need urgently to look at that, if only because per rata of population, Moldova is taking in the highest percentage of refugees at the moment, and that could also destabilize the country. And we need to look at Georgia, obviously, which hasn't been talked about much in the crisis, but where obviously the enclaves of Ossetia and Abkhazia also give Russia leverage or even possibilities of other types of military invasion as well. Now, Sven quite rightly mentioned Africa, and I take this rather pessimistic view of the way in which a few Wagner mercenaries increasingly ingratiating themselves with the government in Mali has made France, and therefore in the wake of France, the EU terminates some of its operations there. But there is an opportunity here, particularly as France and the EU think about how to sort of recentrer the operations, for example, in Niger, more towards Chad. There's obviously the need to help Ivory Coast and Senegal, two relatively successful African countries, but where the jihadist threat, the organized criminal gang threat is now extending south as well. And so to some degree, the way in which Balkans is being rethought and Takuba, I do think gives the opportunity to the EU, and I agree entirely with what Sven said about the emphasis on the South, to take a fresh look at this whole issue. And of course, it's on the one hand, how do you deal with Russia and China as spoiler factors, but it's also the threat of jihadism, which is now a very real threat throughout this region, both in terms of the way in which ISIS and Al-Qaeda with their local proxies have regenerated themselves in this region and spread their influence. The majority of terrorist attacks, 80% of terrorist attacks in the world, are now occurring in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's also, of course, the challenge of how do you sort of get on with sort of difficult local governments, as we've discovered in Mali or Burkina Faso with the coup of late, or in Tunisia with Kais Saied gaining power, or the difficulties, of course, of the elections in Libya. How do you deal with difficult local governments, but where obviously you need some kind of dialogue to make them security partners alongside you? So neighborhood policy is important. Now, my last comment concerns collective defense. What we're seeing, of course, now, I think is a major challenge to the EU to go beyond seeing strategic autonomy as doing the things that NATO doesn't do, particularly in terms of crisis management and stabilization operations on the periphery of Europe, and start thinking very seriously about how the EU is also militarily going to defend itself, both within NATO and as a partner to NATO. We've had, since the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, a quite remarkable sort of recommitment of American power in Europe. The United States has sent an additional 15,000 troops to Europe. The numbers of American forces in Europe are now going back up to 100,000. And this includes also aircraft and so on. But we're not certain at the moment to what degree those American reinforcements will be simply temporary until somehow the situation in Ukraine settles down into some kind of pattern, as difficult as it is to foresee what that is going to be at the moment, and how many of those American forces are going to be stationed permanently, as of course the Baltic states and Poland would dearly like. But there is an opportunity now to Europeanize more NATO's collective defense posture, and therefore bring the EU and NATO closer together as military actors. The proposal I'm going to make today is that if you look at the 4 multinational battalions that NATO set up after 2014 and the annexation of Crimea in Poland and the Baltic states, only one is led by an EU country, which is Germany and Latvia. The Brits lead in Estonia, the Americans in Poland, and Lithuania, and the Canadians lead in Latvia. But now NATO has taken the decision to establish 4 multinational battalions in the Black Sea region. France is offering to lead in Romania. The Czechs have yesterday committed 650 troops for a battalion in Slovakia. And this is a possibility to have European countries in the lead. And therefore the EU, while the US, as Sven rightly says, and NATO focus very much, as they have done since 2014, on Poland and the Baltic states, the EU, Europe takes more the responsibility of dealing with the southern part of the Black Sea area as well. That is an opportunity. Secondly, Germany. How do we Europeans feel about Germany now having by far the largest army in Europe, in the EU, if 2% really is spent on defense? Germany will be spending far more than Russia on defense if it goes to 2%, and spends 100 billion euros on equipment. We welcome it. Of course we welcome it, because we need a modern Bundeswehr and we need a Germany committed. But this is an opportunity not simply to have heavy German tank divisions for the collective defense of NATO, but European heavy tank divisions to bring in France, Italy, Poland, and some of the other actors around Germany as a framework nation for providing much of the bulk armor. Because clearly the United States is not going to give up its Indo-Pacific strategy and priorities, notwithstanding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and therefore some kind of EU-NATO dialogue on how the Europeans can take up in air defense, in anti-missile defense, electronic warfare, maritime commitments, some of what the extra capabilities that NATO needs will be. I think this is an opportunity for a dialogue, and I think the EU really needs to start thinking very imaginatively about this, not just strategic autonomy as outside Europe, but what the Europeans can do. I mean, the way in which, for example, the EU has invited the US and Norway to participate in PESCO programs is the way forward. Very quickly, Jamie, because I've run out of time, Georg, but let me just end also by saying that the Brits have interestingly re-engaged in Europe in the wake of the Ukraine crisis. Liz Truss attended her first meeting of EU foreign ministers last weekend. Okay, no time to talk about this now. We're out of time, but this is also an opportunity, perhaps, for imaginative EU diplomacy to see how we re-engage on the back of the Ukrainian crisis, the UK more in European defence, particularly as the UK has set up a facility at Sennelager in Germany. So let me stop there, but I think this is a time where the EU needs some bold thinking, as well as patting itself on the back for the excellent performance Jamie. Up to now.
Fantastic. So you see this as a possibility of much closer NATO-EU cooperation. And I think we are all struck by the fact that at the same time we're having a debate in Sweden, in Finland, about possibly joining NATO, we also receive here in Brussels letters from the Swedish and Finnish prime ministers asking for the EU to think actively about the remit and the meaning of the EU's own Article 5 clause, if that's what it is, the 42.7. I would like maybe Tania and Sven to come in and comment on that. Both of them actually have to leave a little bit before the others, so it'd be very interesting to hear Tania and Sven on how they see this burden sharing going forward between NATO and the EU. There are also a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. I will give the floor in a little while to Anna, who wanted to ask a question about defense investments, but also got a question from Mark Piper that I will ask on the behalf of him. He said that the UK and the US warned yesterday that Russia could be setting the stage to use chemical weapons in Ukraine. And that this is one of the big risks in coming up. To what extent does and should the strategic compass address those type of threats, biological and chemical threats? Is this a role for the EU? Is this a role for the strategic compass? Is this an area where we need to step up in the context of what you've spoken about the different forms of threats we're facing, from the hybrid threats, from disinformation to indeed hard challenges? But Tania and Sven, as you have to leave a little bit earlier than the rest, please take the floor to respond. Tania, we start with you again.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'll try to do kind of a fireside type of thing to give a bit of a flavor for, well, everything that was mentioned. So first I saw Anna's question on investment in defense capabilities. That is indeed one of the key pillars of the strategic compass under the banner of Invest, where we look at proposals of how to spend more and better in defense. Also a topic for leaders to discuss in that side today, how to take more advantage of collaborative frameworks. And here I just want to mention that the European Commission is playing an absolutely key role. Those who watch our EU defense watchers or Commission watchers will know that the Commission has launched this defense package a couple of weeks ago in February. This has fed directly into the strategic compass. So there again, we look at how to take more advantage of EU tools to decrease our fragmentation, to use our limited money better, to become more efficient. And then on top of that, we also look at military mobility, investing in technologies, innovation, how to boost all of that much more smartly. Very quickly, one point that Elena mentioned on doing the threat analysis earlier than planned. Yes, that's one of the discussions that we are having. I can confirm that we are discussing about that, given that Russia has put into question so many of the pillars and principles that we have assumed in a way in the strategic compass. There's also an active discussion on CSDP missions and operations effectiveness, how we have to rethink our missions and operations in the field, how do we have to adapt that? And it's not just in the south, mind you, in Mali and what's happening with Wagner there and in other countries as well, but it's also in Ukraine, where we have an EU advisory mission that is also in the process of rethinking a bit its mandate and how it can contribute to the crisis. Fourth, on PESCO, I would add, on top of military mobility, I would also add that the cyber response team, which is a PESCO project, has also become quite relevant in the context of the war in Ukraine. So that's something I think that deserves more attention from the EU and member state side, because as we know, member states are in the lead there as well. On CBRN, yes, it's in the compass, because the compass has a holistic 360 degrees view of the threats and challenges that we face. So I can say a word on that. On NATO, very quickly, it's mentioned 25 times in the latest draft. So I can assure everyone that there's a very clear recognition of NATO's role, and there is so much for the EU to do in between to enhance our common security. Sven said it, from hybrid to crisis management, military mobility, tech capabilities, everything that rests under the banner of resilience and much more. Jamie also talked a lot about the strategic dependencies, what we do in trade and so on and so forth. And on resilience, by the way, and EU-NATO, I was happy enough to participate in the first EU-NATO dialogue on resilience, where it emerged very clearly from both sides that we have so much more to do in this area, in full complementarity and mutual complementarity, if I can add. Quickly on the Balkans, yes, in our chapter on partners, it's again a very big pillar of the compass, where we don't only look at NATO and the more obvious, so to call them partners, like the US, Canada, Norway, and the UK, I might add. It's very clearly mentioned, and it will remain. The Western Balkans are a key component of that, and generally the neighborhood. The Western Balkans was mentioned, so I think it's important to say that there's this awareness that the security and stability in the Balkans is not a given; it cannot be taken for granted, and there are concrete proposals on how to act in there. Final point, and then I have to run to another meeting, unfortunately. 42.7 also has which is known as the Mutual Assistance Clause. It has a very prominent role in the compass. Was strengthened, I can also say, and it's under what we call the ACT chapter, because it's all about acting in solidarity and deepening our mutual understanding of how we can use this clause better to act together in solidarity as Europeans. So that's it. I hope I managed to cover a bit of everything that was said. Thank you very much for the invitation again. I'm really sorry that I can't stay until the end.
Thank you, Tania. It was great to have you with us. Sven, I know you're also a bit pressed with time, so I'll pass directly on to you. And I think Tania has answered a lot of the questions we got already in the chat box. I see there's a new one now from Andrew Duff, who asked, what's the relevance of Macron's E2I project in the context of the compass? And I think that raises a broader question. What is going to happen now outside the EU, and what's going to happen in terms of European EU capability or capacity developments? You spoke earlier about the EU's rapid deployment capacity that's being discussed in the compass. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Georg. And Elena, you also challenged me to say something about PESCO. So here you are. I mean, the beauty of PESCO, which if you think about it, is surprising that from the start, it could be used to generate any capability. You know, it doesn't have to be something that you could use for for the type of operations that we have done until now under the EU flag. If you want to, I mean, technically speaking, you want to develop an aircraft carrier, you can do it. If you want to develop a main battle tank or a surface-to-air missile, anything is possible within PESCO. So there is no limit. The only limit is what we want to do. So I would say now is the time to use it and link PESCO much more clearly to the entirety of the defense effort of the EU member states by saying this is the tool that you can use to generate the forces that you need to deter and defend collectively our territory. I would play on that, because of course there is also a risk that some countries will say that now is not the time to invest more in the EU, but they will say, you see, when push comes to shove, you need the US and NATO, so let's focus on that. And I would say, no, now is the time precisely to link them together much more than we have done in the past. EI2, I always thought was a good initiative in the sense that we have a debate there that we have nowhere else in the EU, and indeed, which we not really have now in the compass, which is in which scenarios, in which part of the world do we think we need to assume which responsibility? For example, what is our policy now on Mali? The EUTM, strangely, is still in Mali, whereas member states individually have been kicked out. So are we now training the armed forces of a regime that is backed by the Russians? You know, at the very least, this needs some discussion. So this is the type of debate that I think we ought to import now into the EU structures themselves. And on that note, I also have to apologize and switch to another online meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Many thanks also to you, Sven. I think Elena and Jamie, you have seen the questions that have been asked. A lot of that has been answered already, but there was a question, for instance, on capability development. How fast will this move forward now in the EU? What will we, for instance, see? What do you expect we will see coming out of the Versailles summit? How significant are the 100 billion investments that Germany has announced? Do you think that we can really get our act together quickly now at the European level? And then I think it's the moderator's privilege to sort of ask a final question, if I may. I think I would very much like us to reflect in the final question, the agonizing question. I mean, of course, nobody has a complete and a good answer to this, but looking at Russia's continuing offensive, what more can we do to help Ukraine in your view? And is there a way out? maybe we can do this in the reverse order from what it started, and start off with Jamie, and then Elena to wrap it all up. Jamie.
Georg, thanks very much. I mean, on the capabilities, of course, a lot of more money is now coming in, even before the Ukrainian crisis, the Russian invasion, and on the back, of course, of the whole effort that the EU and NATO have been making in defence since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. European budgets have been going up. I mean, in NATO alone, it was calculated at about 125 billion euros had been added to the collective budgets from non-US sources. That's already quite a lot of money. Even Germany, before this decision by the new government, defence budgets were going up by 8% a year. So now Poland is talking about 3% of GDP. We've got, for example, Lithuania announcing 2.5%. So I think that for the EU, the most important thing is to make sure we don't waste this money. If the sort of coffers are suddenly opening up, we've got to make sure that we don't repeat all of the mistakes in Europe that we've repeated in the past. Too many competing programs, too much duplication of effort, not being able to exploit R&D because we don't have a venture capital market to invest in emerging technologies. This is the moment where the EU has got to come up with a coordinated plan for how we get the best value for the euro. Because as you know, the problem in Europe with all of the duplication and competing programs is that according to McKinsey, that did a study for Elena in the European Parliament a few years back, 25 billion euros a year was simply wasted, even in the R&D field, on duplicating programs. So we need some kind of coherence, some kind of direction as to how the money can be best spent. Otherwise,
is that happening now? Is that happening now? Coming to Anna's question. Do we have
I think that
for this
the
to happen?
EU can really take on, Georg. The other thing, just very briefly, is the balance between readiness and new investment. So, part of the lesson of, unfortunately, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is we need to have more forces in high state of readiness deployed on borders. So a lot of money is simply going to be spent on maintaining the current battle order. For example, the NATO response force has been deployed for the first time in its history, because you need to be able to react to a very short notice possible aggression by Russia. That can no longer be ruled out. There's going to be more exercises. They're expensive. So how to get that balance between, the readiness levels of what you have vis-a-vis investing in all of the new, future capabilities based on new technologies so that we're ready in 20 years' time. And again, that I think is also an area where the EU has a steering role to play. I'll stop there so Elena can come in, but I'm happy to come back, Georg, on the question of where do we go with Ukraine if there's time at the end.
Brilliant. We'll give the floor to Elena, and then we can see if we have time for you to come back to that. And I see also John Palmer is asking you a question. But Elena, please, over to you.
Well, on the capabilities, as Tania said and Jamie alluded to, I think there are two separate questions. One is, have we been working towards this? And we have, and more money is there, and more structures and proposals are there. And to sum them up, I think apart from the defense fund, was incentivizing research and development in the EU, I think the Commission proposals that just came up, and they will be discussed a lot in Versailles about how to give financial incentives for the European industry, are very important. And then we have PESCO. So there's a range of mechanisms, and there is more money. But I think therein lies the challenge, because when there is a higher budget, it becomes even more important to use it correctly. Otherwise, the waste is bigger than it would have been otherwise. And in that sense, I think what Ukraine highlights is the need to refine even more our collaborative planning processes. And here I refer to the CDP, the capability development planning card, which is something that is run, including through the ADA, but also to the degree possible, the coordination with the NDPP, the NATO Defense Planning Project. I mean, there should be a focus on the planning to avoid any redundancies. I also think Ukraine, in an outside the EU way, has demonstrated the importance of interoperability, because if anyone is following interoperability and training, because if anyone is following the fighter jet question, there is this issue of, Ukrainians can only fly these specific types of planes. And this is an outside the EU situation, but We have to be sure that whatever capabilities we have, the whole range of Europeans, and I would argue also NATO's, can use the same, well, to the degree necessary, interoperable, but also equipment. Another thing related to capabilities, however, is undoubtedly the impact on the economy. And there we have to be smart. Versailles is coming up. It's also a growth summit, let us not forget. It's about industry and growth. And the defense industry provides jobs. And also we are facing a time where inflation, energy prices, etc., will constrain budgets. So I think it's also important to think, as Jamie mentioned, thinking of our report before, of, you know, economically and in terms of economies of scale. At the same time, I think we are undoubtedly at a time where there is an acknowledged security crisis, which makes defense budget go up, which, by the way, if one looks at past experience, makes public opinion more supportive of defense spending. So there are a lot of proposals there on how to go about spending more on defense in a time where financial issues are being more constrained. And finally, and I close here, obviously not everything is off the shelf everywhere at the same time. So when a crisis is there at the border and capabilities are needed, there is short-term planning and there is long-term planning. And I would suggest, I think whoever follows the debates knows, none of the two should be lost. So that we should be looking at what is needed now, but also what is needed in the future in the context of hybrid threats, the various theaters, and what, again, foresight shows us that rivals may do in different theaters in 5-10 years, because let's not remember, capabilities are not developed in a day.
Thank you for that, Tania. I think apologies. Thank you for that, Elena. I think your answers both point in the same direction. We need capabilities, we need investments, but there are real challenges if Europeans are to get more bang for the buck or bang for the euro, given the history of duplication. And also there's a big question you're pointing to, Elena, which is the state of public finances and the capacity to finance this over the long run. I think with that, we have run out of time, I'm afraid. I saw there was an additional question from John Palmer to you, Jamie, but I'm sure you could take that bilaterally. It's been a very interesting discussion. I've taken from this discussion the idea that the strategic compass remains a highly relevant and important document, not because of only the immediacy of the questions around defense in the context of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, but also for all the other broader dimensions of security and defense that needs to be answered in Europe today, and different regions, our neighborhood, but also different levels of threat. So thank you to everyone for joining. It was a fascinating discussion. We are busy wishing all those that have to finalize this process in the next few days the best of luck, and we will really happily return with further debates and discussions around the questions of Europe's strategic outlook. Thank you to everyone for joining, and have a lovely day. Thank you.